research is something that has changed massively as a result of the internet. We now have more content available than ever before, and it's easier to locate. However good Google is, though, it is not going to be your primary tool as a researcher. After all, if you can look up something in Google, why would you pay someone else to do that for you? So you will probably found in the early stages of your law degree, you were walking across well-trodden paths with a lot of help, and the things you needed to find out, the cases you needed to find, and so on, were relatively easy to find. And you may have managed to get by just by using some very simple techniques. But as you go up through the levels of your law degree, it's becoming more difficult. And certainly as a graduate, you're going to be going into unexplored territory as a researcher, and you're not simply going to be able to find something on the first page of a Google search that will answer your question. So one of the things that makes legal research different from Googling is that a lot of the information is kept on specialist databases, and those databases are not accessible from Google necessarily. In fact, most of them are subscription based, and while you're a student, the university will pay your subscription fees for you, so you can actually have access to them. But you will have to search these databases individually and separately quite often. And that's going to involve a lot of repetitive work, which is why you need to plan your search strategy carefully to avoid facing a lot of dead ends, and to face having to continually repeat your work and to go back into LexisNexis because you've forgotten to search for a certain term or a certain idea, and then you have to go and research in those other databases again. So through careful planning, you can minimize this and it'll be easier. So here are 4 basic tips that will help you think about what you do when you go about researching. Number 1, write down your plan. The term web surfing is one you don't hear much anymore, but it's a term that came around in the early days of the internet to describe the sort of state you get in when you just explore randomly, clicking from one link to another, just gradually finding more interesting things as you explore. It's a pretty aimless way to do things, and you can certainly find some very interesting things that way, but as a researcher, it's a very, very bad way of going about things. You need to be really focused on what you're doing and have a plan on what you do. And unfortunately, too many students use the web surfing approach to research when they come to researching their assignments. Okay, so I'm looking for changes to the Tasmanian drink driving laws. Okay. That's the old legislation. There's a new act must be somewhere. What have we got down here? Oh, damn, that's a dead link. Okay, we'll try searching. Oh, places to drink in Tasmania. Oh, that's interesting. That gin place looks really interesting. Oh, Josh likes gin. It's his birthday next week. Oh, I'll just go over to Facebook and see if he's posted a link to the party. So, just as I always advise students to write down their research topic on a post-it note to keep it concise and firmly in mind while they're researching, I also recommend you write down your search strategy as well. This can take lots of different forms, but often lists of terms grouped into specific areas, parts of the topic. You can do it a bit like a mind map with lines going around, linking key components together. It should be a working document, and it should be there to remind you that every time you search a particular database, that you're going to need to do the same sort of searches in the next place that you look. Now, you should include all the keywords that you're going to use. And if those keywords are comprised of common words, you might need to start thinking very carefully about alternatives. So, for instance, the term domestic violence is made up of 2 very common words, domestic and violence. And if you were looking for those 2 things individually, you'd have millions and millions of results on domestic and millions of results on violence. And not all of them would be involving those 2 terms together. Now, Google is better at filtering these things these days, but you still need to know the tools that you use to work around combinations. So remember that using quote marks will search for that specific term in that specific order. Quote marks domestic violence will mean you're searching for domestic and violence, those words together, that order, not violence domestic, for instance. You can use a plus sign as an alternative, and that will search for both terms in either order. And that might be useful at some points as well. But Doing this will actually make things a lot easier for you, and it will start breaking down a topic and thinking about what those things are. And a lot of areas of law, if you're talking about criminal law or developments in criminal law, use very interchangeable terms, and it can sometimes be difficult to find the specific thing you're looking for. So I guess the point of this is when you're Googling or using any search engine that's part of a database, always do it actively. Don't do it passively. Don't sit there and surf and just click on things and hope that you'll find what you want. Have a plan. Remember that you can also use an asterisk to have a wildcard search that will include multiple terms with the same prefix, the same beginning of the word. So CRIM asterisk will pick up things like crime, criminal, criminology. Of course, it'll also pick up things like crimson, crimping, and crimples, whatever they are. So you also have to be careful as to where you use wildcards. So always look for the best way to structure your searches, and always look for alternative words that you can use that are more specialised or more focused than the ones that you've started with. And as with any sort of part of research, you have to be prepared to modify as you go and to be flexible. But remember that every time you make a change, when you're partway through a research process, you're going to have to go back and search the places you've already searched to make sure that you haven't missed anything. All right. Tip number 2 is carefully record citations as you find them. And this goes doubly sure for when you are using a quotation or taking a quotation from a text. Don't leave it till later. Don't think you're going to be able to re-find the citation. Make sure you write it down, even if it's in a working document, straight away, and make sure that you reference everything clearly. And one of the problems with this that you have to be very careful about is often during the life of a research project, you will cut and paste from one document to another quite often. And what can happen there is sometimes you can lose the formatting along the way. And something which starts out being linked to a citation becomes unlinked, and something which you have a quote that in your document looks like it's referenced properly as a quote, suddenly loses those reference markings. And somewhere down the track, it might start thinking, well, I don't remember writing that, but it's really clever. I must have written that at some point. And every year there are a large number of students who get picked up on plagiarism just for being sloppy. Not necessarily deliberately, but it's too bad if you get caught. You still have to face the consequences, even if it was just because you were being slack that you accidentally plagiarized something rather than deliberately doing it. So keep that in mind. Always make sure you carefully write those citations down. Tip number 3, and this is a more general research tip, but I think it's really useful to mention here, is always start with the hubs. Always start with a point where you look at research documents, you look at sources that will produce multiple other avenues for you to follow up on. Now, an obvious one there is a textbook. Textbooks are the sort of thing that you don't usually cite as a research source, but they contain lots and lots and lots of other sources and other references to keep you going. You'll also find that there might be good research articles and journal articles that are something like an overview of the changes to insolvency law. And suddenly you go, there's heaps and heaps of sources I can follow up. So start with those hubs, those good solid bases of information that you probably aren't going to necessarily be able to cite in your final research, but they will lead you on to lots of other sources. Now, the only caution I have about this is that you have to be careful about currency, because obviously the textbook is not going to reference anything that comes out after the textbook is published. So you are going to have to make sure that when you do that, that you check what recent developments have occurred or what recent publications have occurred, and that's where you go to noting up services or your legal encyclopedias and other methods for making sure you're up to date. Because one trick that academics like to do is set you a problem essay on an area of law that has just changed recently and that those changes are not reflected in your textbook. And they can very quickly sort out who's on the ball and who's not, and who just copied things out of old study guides and textbooks, and who's actually looked the law up and knows where those changes have occurred. So bear that in mind. All right, and the fourth and final tip I have here, which is linked into this, I guess, is even though I've cautioned you against surfing aimlessly, the one place where it can be useful are journals. If you find that there are a small number of journals that are useful in the field and that may have been referenced several times by other authors, then you can actually find a lot of interesting things just by scanning. You go to the website for the journal and you scan the indexes of the recent issues of the journal. The last few years, just scan through what's been published in that particular journal. And that's particularly true if it's a specialist journal. So the example I gave earlier of insolvency law, you go to the insolvency lawyer or the insolvency law journal, and you go through the last few years of their indexes and go, okay, what's been published in this field? And you may find there are things that you've missed in other searches, or areas you didn't think to search that suddenly become very important and relevant that appear there. Because there's another little tip. What academics like to do is sometimes they like to find an obscure or not so obscure journal article and base an essay around that particular article, and seeing who's actually clever and who actually goes out and finds that article, and who again just goes back to the old material. So anyway, that's 4 basic tips to think about. But the core message here to bear in mind all the time is plan. Make a plan. Write it down. Don't waste time when it comes to research. You have little enough time as it is, and you certainly don't have time to surf around aimlessly in the hopes that you find something useful.